As a poet, translator, critic, and essayist, Ezra Pound exerted a profound influence on English literature in the 20th century. A voracious reader, his work teems with allusions and references to authors who captured his attention. Because of his political activities and socio-economic theories, Pound still generates controversy. In both his own work and through advancing the work of others he admired, Pound represents a seminal moment in defining the modernist aesthetic. With such a vast and eclectic legacy, Ezra Pound is a literary figure who defies easy classification.
When I carefully consider the curious habits of dogs, I am compelled to conclude that man is the superior animal. When I consider the curious habits of man, I confess, my friend, I am puzzled.
Ezra Loomis Pound was born in Idaho on October 30th, 1885. A year and a half later, Pound's father accepted a job in Philadelphia, and the family moved to the outskirts of the city, where Pound spent most of his childhood. He attended the University of Pennsylvania for 2 years, then moved on to Hamilton College, where he studied Anglo-Saxon and Romance languages and received a degree in philosophy. In 1906, he entered the University of Pennsylvania to study literature. Soon after, he received a scholarship to carry out research in Spain on the playwright Lope de Vega. In 1907, he came back to the States to take a job teaching Romance languages at Wabash College in Indiana. His stint as a teacher lasted barely 4 months. Pound found himself deeply at odds with American educational institutions. He felt that, when it came to art, they were simply getting it all wrong.
You cannot give a recipe for composing a Mozartian melody. We should not ask an art teacher a recipe for making a drawing like Leonardo da Vinci. This is the reason for the extreme boredom produced by the current professorial documentation. The great experts often ignore the stupidity of the pedagogical routine.
In 1908, Pound traveled to Venice as a journalist, bringing with him the manuscript of his first book of poems, A Lume Spento. These verses, influenced by medieval troubadours and poets, reveal Pound's obsession with recovering the literary past, a fascination that would be in evidence throughout his writing career. Pound delighted in the precise language he found in the works of troubadours such as Arnaud Daniel or Renaissance writers like Guido Cavalcanti. He was captivated by their ability to render subjective experiences on the page. These texts would exert a profound influence over Pound's works. In September of 1908, Pound decided to travel to London to contact William Butler Yeats, the contemporary poet whom he most admired. Once settled in the British capital, he began attending weekly meetings of writers organized by Yeats. The two developed a strong friendship, and Yeats encouraged Pound's poetic career. Yeats said of Pound, "There is no generation of young poets. Ezra Pound is a solitary volcano." In 1908, Pound published 2 books of poetry, Personae and Exaltations. The next year he brought forth a book of literary criticism entitled the spirit of romance. In these early critical essays, Pound weighed in with those who called for plain-spoken poetry, not heavily stylized or adorned. Pound applied this aesthetic to his job as a correspondent for the prestigious Chicago-based magazine Poetry. Through Pound's influence, poetry became an influential proponent of modernism. One of his roles at the magazine was to suggest poets he admired and then edit their work before sending it to the press. Though he recommended a few established poets, most of his selections were young writers at the outset of their careers. Among the works he edited was a series of poems by Yeats, who discovered Pound's modifications only after the poems had been published. Although initially furious at the unapproved changes, Yeats later admitted that Pound had actually improved his poetry. Perhaps the most famous example of Pound's editorial efforts was his revision of The Waste Land, the groundbreaking masterpiece of modernism by his close friend T.S. Eliot. Among other changes, Pound cut the length of the original manuscript in half. Eliot acknowledged Pound's work by dedicating the poem to him, for Ezra Pound, Il miglior fabbro. Pound was an early proponent of imagism, one of the poetic movements born during the 1920s. Imagists declared that each word should be a visible image. They rejected Victorian sentiment and romance and advocated instead the use of everyday language, the choice of the exactly right word, not the merely decorative one. The movement offered absolute freedom in the choice of themes and encouraged rhythms composed in the sequence of a musical phrase. One of the most well-known Imagist poems is Pound's In a Station of the Metro.
The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough.
In 1914, Ezra Pound married Dorothy Shakespeare in London. That same year, an anthology edited by Pound and entitled Des Imagistes was published, with texts by William Carlos Williams, D.H. Lawrence, and James Joyce. The following year, that same group published a new anthology, Some Imagist Poets, though Pound did not take part in it. In 1915, Pound published an anthology of his own translations of Chinese poetry entitled Cathay. His love of translation was not shared by all his contemporaries. Pound's friend Robert Frost was of the opinion that poetry is what is lost in translation. Even as a translator, Pound managed to be controversial, omitting words that bothered him and slashing verses he considered too long. His work was more poetic adaptation than faithful translation of the originals.
The rustling of the silk is discontinued. Dust drifts over the courtyard. There is no sound of footfall, and the leaves scurry into the heaps and lie still. And she, rejoicer of the heart, is beneath them, a wet leaf that clings to the threshold.
While he continued his efforts as an editor and critic, Pound also began the most important poetic undertaking of his life, a work which would demand over 50 years' toil and would make him an undisputed giant in modern poetry, the Cantos. This, his great epic poem of over 500 pages, was published in parts and in different editions from 1917 until 1969, just a few years before his death. In the Cantos, Pound conjured a mosaic of images, ideas, political maxims, ethics, economic insights, and anecdotes based on an assortment of readings by authors from disparate cultures and times. Critics and readers alike have admired the poetic beauty of the Cantos, but beyond its initial sections, in which he put his lyrical aesthetic on full display, Pound's intention was to write a work of history that would produce real social change. In this endeavor, he failed to gain his colleagues' support. In 1920, Pound moved with his wife to Paris. There he met the American writers Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway, who declared himself a friend and admirer of Pound. In 1924, the couple settled in Italy. Pound was proud of his ability to travel light.
Thanks to my parents who owned a house, I realized and struggled for years not to possess anything that cannot be put in a suitcase.
During this period, Pound discovered his passion for economics. Living in Italy, he felt he had found a society akin to those of ancient Greece and Rome, where culture and the arts were not subordinated to the laws of the market. Pound believed that in Europe and America, usury prevailed as the main form of economic activity. Pound grew obsessed with the economic situation of his country and expressed his position in his poetry.
With usura hath no man a house of good stone, each block cut smooth and well-fitting, that design might cover their face. With usura hath no man a painted paradise on his church wall.
During the 20s, Ezra Pound composed several essays on economics and politics, in which he restated the views he had expressed in his poems.
Credit is a social product. It does not depend on the individual alone. The trust you have in me paying you back 100 liras in 10 years is based on the social order, the degree of civilization, the probabilities and possibilities of human conglomeration.
In 1933, Pound published the book ABC of Economics, with the aim of spreading his doctrine of social credit, a new economy that was free of usury. Pound's innovation and experimentation in poetry and criticism had always generated strong feelings from his colleagues and readers, but nothing prepared him for the chorus of censure that was to greet his political activities. In 1939, Pound returned to the United States. He wanted to meet with Franklin Roosevelt and suggest to him a new direction for the American economy. The meeting never took place. By the time he returned to Italy, Germany had already launched its military strike against Poland. The Second World War had begun. Naively believing that their political philosophies would put into practice his economic ideals, Pound expressed sympathy for Italy and Germany's position and became an adherent of Mussolini's fascist movement. Pound agreed with anti-Semites who believed that the economic system was being exploited by Jewish financiers. In early 1941, he began broadcasting propaganda supporting Italian fascism and German Nazism from Radio Roma. He continued these broadcasts even after the United States entered the war in 1941. In 1943, an American federal court accused Ezra Pound of treason. In 1945, he was arrested by American forces and imprisoned for weeks in an open-air cage in Pisa, where he suffered physical hardship and a partial mental breakdown. In spite of his condition, Pound devoted himself to reading and translating the Chinese philosopher Confucius during his incarceration. While in prison, he took up poetry again and wrote the Pisan Cantos. From Pisa, Pound was transferred to Washington, D.C. in anticipation of indictment proceedings for treason. However, he was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was remanded to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He would spend the next 12 years there. During those years, friends and writers such as T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost campaigned for his release. Meanwhile, living in virtual isolation, Pound went on writing the Cantos.
for the 7 lakes, and by no man these verses. Rain, empty river, a voyage, fire from frozen cloud, heavy rain in the twilight under the cabin roof was one lantern. The reeds are heavy, bent, and the bamboos speak.
With the Cantos, his longest and most important poem, Ezra Pound gave shape to his literary and personal experiences. His life and his work became one. In 1958, after 12 years of detention at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Ezra Pound was released. He returned to Italy with Dorothy. In Murano, their daughter Mary and her husband were waiting for them. In the years that followed, Pound would divide his time among Rapallo, Venice, and Murano, where his son-in-law's castle was located. In 1959, he published Thrones, which, together with his book Rock Drill, published in 1955, gathered together the material he had composed while in St. Elizabeth's. 10 years would pass before the publication of Drafts and Fragments, which contained his final, almost tragic meditations on his poetic life. In 1965, he traveled to London to attend T.S. Eliot's funeral. This would be one of his last public appearances. His life was already marked by deep depression, and he spent his days secluded with books and memories. Ezra Pound died on November 1st, 1972, in Venice.
Prefer my cloak unto the cloak of dust, 'neath which the last year lies, for thou shouldst more mistrust time than my eyes.
Despite being imprisoned and harshly criticized for his political affiliations and activities, Ezra Pound remains an extraordinary poet who may have been the most important single catalyst for literature in the 20th century. Yeats, Eliot, Joyce, William Carlos Williams, Hemingway, Frost. The poets whose work he championed reads like a virtual roll call of modern masters. And his poetic legacy, crowned by the Cantos, is as rich and complex as the life he led.